Kallid külalised, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear keepers and researchers of the heritage of Baltic diaspora. The Republic of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are celebrating their 100th birthdays in 2018. For this occasion, Baltic countries as well as Baltic diaspora communities are looking back in time and summing up the experience of a century. Such important anniversaries give us the opportunity to make conclusions of what has occurred, but also to look at what has yet to come and make goals for the future. The Baltic Heritage Network is celebrating the 100th birthdays of the Baltic countries with a conference, New Beginnings of Baltic Diaspora, at the Estonian National Museum, which is a good example of a new beginning of an old institution. The historical and present circumstances of the Baltic diaspora are like a garden of forking paths for both individuals and communities. New beginnings are taking place, whether we are paying attention or not. This conference is an effort to look at the endings and new beginnings of communities and their archives, both at present time and in retrospect. This conference also celebrates 10 years since the establishment of the Baltic Heritage Network. Non-profit organization BaltHerNet was founded in Tartu in January 2008 to foster cooperation between national and private archives, museums, libraries, institutions of research, public associations and organizations collecting and studying the cultural heritage of the Baltic diaspora. The prehistory of BaltHerNet reaches actually even further back. In the spring of 2005, a group of Estonian Memory Institution representatives gathered in the National Archivist Priit Pirsko's office to discuss the status of our diaspora archives. In June 2006, we organized our first large-scale conference where a number of Estonians abroad and Baltic colleagues also participated. The following years were full of serious work and learning. Today, we know a great deal more than when we first began working together. It is a great pleasure to look back on what we have accomplished. Heartfelt thanks to all of our colleagues and supporters who have joined us on this journey. Our mission is far from being completed. The Baltic diaspora is still living a lively life, producing new history and heritage which need keepers to protect it. I wish us all strength as we continue this important and gratifying work. I wish all a very successful conference. Long live Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Thank you. Next, it's my pleasure to ask the newly elected director of Estonian National Museum, Alar Karis, to say his welcoming words to you, please.
Dear participants of a conference, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have you here to participate in the Baltic Heritage Network Conference, New Beginnings of a Baltic Diaspora. Also celebrating the 100th birthday of the Baltic countries. It is my great pleasure as the director of the Estonian National Museum to host this event. Thank you very much for coming. Estonian National Museum has always paid a specific attention to Estonians living abroad. Starting from 1970s, there have been a number of expeditions to Estonian settlements around the world. For obvious reasons, in the beginning only to the regions of the former Soviet Union, namely Siberia and Caucasus. Collecting materials, objects, and artifacts from Canada, US, Australia, and other places in the Western world started in 1989. Today there are more than 2,000 items from different parts of the world. In 2011, the archive of Hans Statlaus, together with photographic materials, arrived to our museum. In 2014, the archive of an experimental psychologist and cognitive neuroscientist Endel Tulving was handed over, just to mention a few. Today, almost every family in Estonia, and I guess also in Latvia and Lithuania, has a family member who is living, working, or studying abroad. Different from the previous waves of migration, the main connecting link for the communities of the current migration wave is the internet and the digital communication based on it. This is a new beginning for the diaspora, but also for archives, museums, libraries, and research institutions. Therefore, we are not only focused on Estonians who have been living abroad for decades, but also collecting memories and impressions, for example, of Estonians who moved to Finland, Sweden, Germany, and Canada quite recently. The most recent issue of Estonian National Museum yearbook focuses on Estonian food heritage. 2 out of 5 articles discuss the food culture of Estonians who have built new homes far from their homeland. Tonight, next to our restaurant Pööripäev, there is an opening of the exhibit Food, a Treasury of Estonian Heritage, which was created together with the Museum of Estonians Abroad. You're all welcome to this opening, of course. In conclusion, I would like to thank the National Archive of Estonia, the Estonian Literary Museum, and the Center of Excellence in Estonian Studies to co-organizing this event. To all of you, thank you for being here and enjoy the conference, our museum, and the city of Tartu. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our next greetings come from Anneli Reima from the Ministry of Culture. And she probably also is representing one of our main sponsors for BaltHerNet activities, Compatriots program. So Anneli, please, the floor is yours.
Dear participants of this conference, dear friends and colleagues, I would like to thank you very much that I can attend this wonderful conference today, which is dedicated to the 100 years anniversary of Baltic states. It is remarkable how many similarities there are in our way to independence. And it is important to say that on many occasions we will celebrate our common jubilee together with our Baltic neighbors. I'm convinced that these joint events will bring us more and more closer. I have to tell that Tartu has a great role on the creation of the Estonian independence after the First World War. Many politicians were graduated of the Tartu University. In 1920, Tartu Peace Treaty has been regarded as the birth certificate of the Republic of Estonia because it was the first de jure recognition of the state. This treaty ended the Estonian War of independence between Estonia and the Soviet Russia. Many of the European countries are celebrating the Year of Cultural Heritage this year. Last weekend in Tartu took place a great student song and dance festival, Gaudeamus, and next summer we will celebrate 150 years anniversary of the Estonian Song and Dance Festival in Tallinn, where we all can sing and dance together again. During the years of occupation, the source of strength and glimmer of hope came from our traditions and culture. Our ties have grown stronger since restoration of independence since 1991. We evaluate all the people who have struggled for the independence of our countries, and we have to know how it has happened, how the resistance took place in our countries and abroad by our diasporas. Estonian Compatriots Program, starting from 2004, aims at supporting the Estonians living abroad by helping them preserve their Estonian language skills, maintain Estonian national culture and identity, as well as providing assistance to those who are considering returning to Estonia. And one of the priorities of the program is also to support the collecting, preserving, and making available expatriate cultural heritage. The current program also focuses on recent immigrants and on the descendants of previous generations of expatriates who do not longer speak Estonian. In the current world, the nature of immigration has changed, and its forms are moved manifold than ever before. The Estonian communities in Western countries, in particular those established after the Second World War, have significantly grown after Estonia restored its independence. For example, in Sweden, in Germany, in UK, and there are numerous micro-communities, primarily in Finland and other countries. Estonian communities, especially in Russia, have shrunk in numbers due to the lack of growth or have only marginal increases. These developments are also the subject of historians and archives in the future for our next generations. Our interest and aim is to talk about the history and keep contacts to our diasporas in different countries and make these stories visible and heard today. It is valuable to share the collective memory and keep cultural identity and the sense of belonging and see how different elements of memory cultures work together. I use this opportunity to thank all the organizers of this conference, especially Piret. I know how much efforts you have put to organize this event today, and I wish you all success for today and the next days of the conference and for the joint activities also in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks for those nice greetings, and now to work. Unfortunately, there are some people who were not able to join the conference, and we heard about they're not coming just lately. So if you need to know what the real program is, then you have in your bags this printout. And if you compare it to this program, then you can see that for this first session, we have two speakers. And first of them is Professor Raimo Raag from Uppsala University. And we have enjoyed his speeches before, so I'm pretty sure that that would be a very great start to our 4 days conference program. So, Professor Raag, please.
Thank you very much. When I received the call for papers to this conference, one of the words in the title, New Beginnings of Baltic Diaspora, caught my attention. Perhaps the organizers of the conference had in mind that the conference would be about 3 different diaspora groups, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, and therefore choose to use the plural form of the word beginning, thus implying that each nation has its own new beginning. However, my thoughts also went into a different direction. The plural form of the word beginning in the conference title reminded me of a reflection that first occurred to me in the early 1990s and that reappeared quite recently when I was writing a book about the history of the Estonian diaspora during the last 100 years. The book will be published in October this year by the publisher Post Factum in Tallinn. The specific thought I had was about the circularity of Estonian, perhaps even Latvian and Lithuanian diasporic life. The word circularity implies repetition. In this case, it is about how 2 groups of people give each other a specific name and how this naming reoccurs at intervals. This happened no later than some decades ago when tens of thousands of Estonians moved from Estonia to countries of the Western world, either temporarily or permanently, and very often found compatriots already living in their new country of residence, that is to say, refugees of the Second World War and their descendants. Members of the exile community started calling those who recently had arrived in the country newcomers or new Estonians, whereas the newcomers began to call those already living in the country old residents or old Estonians. History repeats itself. Half a century earlier, when Estonian war refugees, that is to say the present old residents, had arrived in their new country, many of them found other Estonians already living there. What is more, in many places there were national societies, clubs, and other associations that promoted various social activities in the native language. Not quite unexpectedly, the refugees were referred to by their compatriots who already lived in the country as newcomers or new Estonians, whereas the war refugees called those who already lived in the country old residents or old Estonians. The circle was closed. However, even this was not the first time the distinction of old and new Estonians in a specific country was made. The same thing had already happened in the years following 1918. Estonians who had emigrated to the Western world in Tsarist times became old residents, whereas the newly arrived Estonians were newcomers. This is the circularity of Estonian diasporic life I refer to in the title of my presentation. Every new emigration wave since the first years of the 20th century has transformed earlier newcomers into old residents. It may be assumed that the specific features of every emigration wave have determined the relations between the old residents and the newcomers, and have also largely contributed to changes in the diaspora community. If so, one might ask oneself what specific features characterize the old residents and the newcomers of every new wave of emigration. To find an answer to this question, we have to look somewhat more closely at the history of Estonian emigration during the late modern period. But I would also like to take the opportunity to point out some similarities and differences between the emigration history of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians that I think I have been able to notice. The first significant wave of Estonian emigration in the late modern period took place mainly during the second half of the 19th century and was facilitated, perhaps even encouraged, by the abolition of serfdom in the Baltic provinces in 1861, and especially the new passport law in 1863, permitting settlement in any part of the Russian Empire. Many landless Estonian peasants moved eastwards, where they sought agricultural land and established rural settlements. At the beginning, the colonists headed for the nearby governorates of St. Petersburg, Pskov, and Vitebsk. Later, they made for destinations considerably further away: the central Volga region, the Crimea, the Caucasus, western Siberia, and the Russian Far East. A number of Estonians also became town dwellers by moving especially to St. Petersburg and Riga. In 1897, about 120,000 Estonians lived outside the province of Estland, northern Livland, and the town of Narva. Half of the expatriates were located in St. Petersburg Governorate. In a very short time, just a few decades, the capital city of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg, had become the second city only to Tallinn in the size of its Estonian population, Tartu being third. Besides the extensive emigration to Russia, a smaller emigration from the province of Estland and northern Livland was taking place in the opposite direction, mainly to North America, but also to Australia, Brazil, Sweden, Finland, and southern Livland, that is to say, to Latvian lands. The first Estonian immigrants to the United States have been characterized as ship-jumping fishermen who preferred to settle on the Pacific coast, mainly in California and Oregon. A much larger number, if not the bulk of Estonian immigrants to the United States, were rural settlers. At the turn of the century, a number of Estonian villages were established in Wisconsin and the Dakotas. Further settlements appeared in the Rocky Mountain states and the Pacific Northwest. Many Estonian farmers and their families came not directly from Estland or northern Livland, but from the Crimea or other parts of Russia. In 1897, the first Estonian language newspaper outside Estonia, Eesti Ameerika Postimees, the Estonian American Courier, was published by the enterprising clergyman Hans Rebane, who the following year, 1898, also founded an Estonian Lutheran congregation in New York City, a congregation that still exists today. Reverend Rebane had come to the United States at the invitation of the German Missouri Lutheran Synod to be a pastor to immigrant Estonians and Latvians of Lutheran faith. In 1896, 1 year before he started publishing the Estonian language newspaper, he had launched a newspaper in Latvian, Amerikas Vestnesis, sorry for the pronunciation, the American Courier. His achievements in the sphere of spiritual life in the United States are at least as important to Latvians as to Estonians. Estonian immigration to Canada took plays much along the same lines as to the United States. The first immigrants seem to have settled in the southern part of Alberta province, where several Estonian villages were founded. The inhabitants of the villages consisted of immigrants from the Estonian-speaking Baltic provinces, as well as from other parts of the Russian Empire, among others the populous Nurmekunde settlement in Tver governorate. Nurmekunde consisted of 6 villages inhabited by around 2,000 Estonians. By comparison with the emigration to Russia, emigration to North America was almost insignificant. Around 1900, the approximate number of Estonians in North America is estimated to be approximately 10,000. We can't be sure, since Estonia as a country did not exist at the time and the people who arrived were recorded as Russians. A new wave of Estonian immigration began around 1906, after the failure of the Russian Revolution of 1905. Several thousands of revolutionaries and their sympathizers emigrated to Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Americas. The number of Estonians who emigrated to only Stockholm was around 800. Evidently, the revolutionary currents reached as far as Australia. The members of the Estonian Society in Melbourne, founded in 1914, 1 year later decided to break the habit of using the titles Herra, Mr. and Isand, Master, in front of their surnames in the minutes, and began to use Seltsimees, comrade, instead. Many of the revolutionaries were more politically radical than the earlier immigrants. This increased serious friction not only among urban Estonian immigrants, but also in a number of rural Estonian settlements in the United States and Canada. Reverend Rebane, for instance, feuded with Estonian socialists until his death in 1911. Even if some left-wing radicals went back to their native country in 1917 to work for the Bolshevik state, there were enough politically radical Estonians left in North America to continue to carry out political mischief. This was going to have far-reaching consequences. Around the turn of the century, Estonian immigration had begun to change its character. Most earlier immigrants into North America were farmers who had settled primarily in rural areas, but new immigrants were increasingly becoming city dwellers. The first national Estonian city societies had been founded in St. Petersburg and Riga already in 1880, and were followed by Moscow in 1900, Helsinki in 1903, San Francisco in 1904, Stockholm in 1905, Berlin and Baku in 1910, Sydney in 1912, Melbourne and Boston in 1914, New York in 1916, Kiev and Harbin in Manchuria in 1917, and London in 1918. This trend was further strengthened after the end of the Great War, when a new wave of immigrants from Estonia began to arrive. Estonian city societies of various kinds began to crop here, there, and everywhere. Shanghai in 1920, Copenhagen in 1922, Buenos Aires and Danzig in 1924, Sao Paulo, Cleveland, and Paris in 1925, Detroit in 1926, Kaunas, Los Angeles, and Vienna in 1928, Winnipeg and Brussels in 1929, etc., etc. The newcomers differed from the earlier Estonian immigrants. Quote, "They were usually young and unmarried. Many had secondary education, and some were university graduates or acquired higher degrees in Canada." Unquote. Accordingly, the aim and direction of the societies started to change. The early organizations were concerned with all areas of life in the rural settlement, or were agricultural cooperatives, cattle sale cooperatives, mutual fire insurance companies, savings and loan cooperative banks, Lutheran congregations, choirs, instrumental ensembles, amateur theatre groups, schools, and libraries. The activities of the new societies that came into being in the towns and cities maintained this general social orientation, but no often with a certain shade of ethnic or patriotic feeling. According to the statutes of several newly established Estonian societies outside Estonia, the aims of the societies were, and this is almost a direct quote from the statutes of several societies, to bring local Estonians together for social intercourse and entertainment, to preserve national traits, and to introduce Estonia and Estonian culture to the public of the country of residence. This ethnic orientation must, I assume, be seen in the light of the establishing of Estonia as an independent republic in 1918, a notable milestone in Estonian history that is likely to have increased Estonian national sentiment. On the one hand, during these times, nationalism was, in addition to socialism, the system of thought that, to the greatest extent, shaped political development. On the other hand, the increasing influence of socialist ideas manifested itself in the emergence of Estonian socialist organizations, a tendency that had already begun before the outbreak of the Great War. Estonian socialist clubs were established in New York, Boston, New London in Connecticut, Baltimore, Elmont on Long Island outside New York, Cleveland, Ohio, San Francisco, and Seattle. The only known Estonian socialist society in Canada appears to have been established in Bankhead, a small coal mining town near the town of Banff in the southern part of Alberta province. An attempt to create a socialist club in the Snake Lake rural settlement in the same province came to nothing, although there were radical socialist activists living there. In the United States and Canada, perhaps also in other countries, although I haven't found enough evidence to confirm this assumption, Estonian radical socialists didn't confine themselves to creating separate organizations and athletic clubs, but endeavored to dominate the existing Estonian organizations. This happened in New York and Portland, Oregon, perhaps also elsewhere. In Portland, the socialist-ruled Estonian Society joined the Estonian branch of the American Socialist Party. Thus, in North America, particularly in the United States, there were two rival Estonian societies, one communist and one non-communist. In small centers, this was a serious problem, as the local community of both parties had to face the issue of the lack of members and the consequent issue of continuation. In larger centers like New York, where there were plenty of Estonians, the situation was not quite so serious, but serious enough. Estonia's independence in 1918 raised tensions even higher, with the organized Estonians now definitely being divided. Some welcomed the independence of Estonia, orientated to the independent state, and tried to further economic, commercial, cultural, and educational ties between the countries of residence and Estonia, whereas others, mainly communists, orientated to the Soviet Union. The communists wanted to see Estonia as part of Bolshevik Russia and consequently also welcomed the annexation of Estonia by the Soviet Union in 1940. They rallied around the newspaper Uus Ilm, the New World, established in New York in 1909 and with a weekly circulation of 550 as from 1925. At the end of the 1920s, most of New York's and Philadelphia's Estonians were woodworkers, machine tool workers, locksmiths, tailors, masonry workers, and electricians. The social basis for the acceptance of left-wing ideas had therefore been rather favorable. Although the Estonian communist associations were full of life in the 1920s and also still in the 1930s, especially in New York, they nevertheless had left the peak of their influence behind. And so, in the course of time, the national organizations managed to consolidate. The advance of the national organizations was most likely due to numerous newcomers arriving from Estonia as a result of the Second World War. As the newcomers were political refugees who had fled to the west from advancing Soviet troops, they were certainly not in sympathy with the Soviet Union. In addition, the number of Estonian refugees was high in comparison to previous Estonian migration waves to the west, approximately 70,000. This meant, metaphorically speaking, a shot in the arm, a much-needed stimulant for national Estonian organizations in the diaspora. Existing national societies were vitalized and the range of organized activities was widened, as was the geographical distribution of the network of Estonian national societies. In addition to existing and newly established local Estonian ethnic societies and clubs, umbrella organizations that represented several associations with the same or similar purpose were founded regionally as well as worldwide. A case in point being the Council of Estonian Societies in Australia, a member of the Estonian World Council residing in the United States. Another significant example is the Union of Estonian Scouts that united Scouts and Scout patrols in Sweden, the United States, Canada, England, Denmark, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. The Scout movement became the most important form of organization for young Estonians in the diaspora. The communist societies did not experience such an addition to their membership, but began to fade away and ceased to exist completely during the early post-war decades. An interval of 50 years, half a century, was to separate the arrival of the war refugees at the end of the Second World War and the immigration following the restoration of independence of Estonia in 1991. Immigrants from Estonia now came primarily for socio-economic or personal reasons, to work, to study, or to broaden their horizons. Again, the new acquisition of manpower, if I may call it that, resulted in a remodeling of the existing diaspora society and in a redefinition of the self-image on part of the old residents, who at once were transformed from political refugees to expatriates when Estonia regained its sovereignty. Now Estonia is no longer a closed society, but is within easy reach for everybody, a development that has been facilitated by the abolition of passport and other types of border control at the mutual borders of the Schengen area, as well as the introduction of internet and social media. In addition to the phenomenon that every new wave of migrants from Estonia has brought about renaming of old and new residents in the new country, Estonian migration in the late modern period presents another repetitive property. The migrants of the 19th century had sought improvement in their living standards. That is to say, that they were basically socio-economic migrants. In contrast, the following wave consisted of refugees who fled the political repression following the revolution of 1905, whereas the migrants who left Estonia in the interwar period were, again, people who did so principally for socio-economic or personal reasons. Then, in connection with the Second World War, it was time for new political refugees to leave their native country. They, in turn, were followed by people who, half a century later, or even later than that, moved to the West basically for socio-economic or personal reasons. This brings us back to the issue of circularity and raises the question whether these properties of Estonian emigration have parallels in Latvian and Lithuanian migration history, or not. Here I prefer, for obvious reasons, to express myself in guarded terms, but I can't refrain from pointing out some similarities. First, the general chronology of emigration, including, second, the circularity of waves of emigration. Significant numbers of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians seem to have moved from their native land starting in the second half of the 19th century, followed by post-1905 refugees, part of whom returned to their homeland in 1917. Then the slow emigration in the 1920s and 1930s, the mass exodus in connection with the Second World War, and finally the westward emigration that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union and was intensified after Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania became members of the European Union in 2004. This chronology, as well as the consequent circular alternation of the principal reasons for emigration, socio-economic or personal versus political motives by turns, is an evident manifestation of the shared political history of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians from 1795 onward. The history of the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian diaspora in the late modern era also presents some apparent differences. The great majority of emigrants from Estonian and Latvian lands in the 19th century was headed for Russia, whereas Lithuanians emigrated mainly to the United States. In this respect, Lithuanian emigrants followed international emigration patterns as the Americas, notably the United States, at that time was the main destination for emigrants from Europe. In the 19th century, some 50 million people left Europe for the Americas. During the most intensive period of emigration between 1899 and 1914, some 250,000 emigrants from Lithuania arrived in the United States, 81% of whom were ethnic Lithuanians. That was equals to almost a quarter of all Lithuanians. The number of Estonians and Latvians in North America was considerably smaller, both in numbers as well as in proportion to the total number of ethnic Estonians and Latvians, in spite of the fact that many Estonian and Latvian settlers in Russia migrated to North America, thus increasing the number of Estonian and Latvian immigrants. Lithuanians also preferred, to a greater extent than Estonians and Latvians, to migrate to South America, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay, even if several Latvian agricultural colonies actually were established in Brazil around the turn of the century. A major immigration of Estonians to South America didn't occur until the years 1924 to 1926, when almost 2,000 Estonians left Estonia for Brazil, many to work in coffee plantations. Sorry. Another difference between early Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian immigrants is that a majority of Estonians at first chose to settle in rural areas in North America and only later tended to move to towns or cities, or encouraged their American-born offspring to do so. In this respect, Estonians were unlike Latvians and Lithuanians, who more or less immediately became city dwellers. So, even if we can point to some dissimilarities in the immigration history of Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians, the general impression remains that there are more significant similarities than striking differences. The chronology, the circularity, the reasons for emigrations, and the countries of destination. If there is more that unites than separates the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian diaspora communities, one can wonder if the plural form "New Beginnings" in the title of this conference is justified. This is what I thought when I first read about this conference. Is there a new beginning or new beginnings of Baltic diaspora? Will each nation have its own new start different from that of the others? Only the stars know what the future holds, but this conference may perhaps answer this question tentatively or more precisely. Thank you for your attention.
As we have some time for questions, then please, and please use the mic because we have this live streaming and otherwise people wouldn't hear what you are talking here. So I see Anne holding hand.
Thank you. Perhaps I should start a pattern of questioners introducing themselves too for the benefit of the other participants. So I am Anne Dundan Smith from Australia, where there are other Australians here who might contradict me, but we understood that our old Estonians who met the new Estonians after World War II included people who had left Estonia after a failed communist coup in 1924. If you mentioned that, I missed it. You were talking about economic migration at that time. Have you found any evidence for political refugees in the 1920s from Estonia or the other Baltic countries?
No, I haven't, actually. The main reasons that are mentioned, at least in the literature I have read, do mention mostly personal motives for leaving Estonia. But we can't be sure, of course. The 1924 coup in Tallinn shaped insecurity on part of immigrants. I know that, but it transpires from memoirs and such literature. But specifically for Australia, I don't know.
I was just wondering, is there a difference between migrants in the beginning of the 90s and, let's say, in 2015, 18? I mean, educational background or attitudes or anything, or is there a wave within a wave, sorry? Or waves within a wave, so, or is it the same pot?
As far as I know, this has not been subject to any deeper research. So once again, I can't answer your question properly, I'm afraid. The experience I have from Sweden, or central Sweden, the Uppsala area, Uppsala is not a very good example, since it's a university town, which means that very many young people come there to study or to have their postdoctoral studies placed in Uppsala, which means that many of them have a higher education. But on the other hand, there are very many people who, mostly men, who come to work as builders and such professions. But whether they are permanent settlers or not is open to debate, since the borders are so open as they are today in Europe.
Any other questions? Riina?
You mentioned the new Estonians and old Estonians, but here in Estonia we usually use the word väliseestlased, abroad Estonians, and former Estonian president Toomas Hendrik Ilves didn't like the word absolutely. So what is your idea or suggestions how we should name those Estonians living abroad? Or it's very easy in Estonian say väliseestlased. It fits together, or easy to say, but
väliseestlane, Estonian abroad, that is a handy term, I would say. I know for the older generation, I'm born in Sweden, as you might know or have guessed, but for my father, who came as a refugee, his generation was, I think there are people who would reject the name väliseestlane and prefer to be called political refugees. This was subject to debate among Estonians abroad, in Sweden at least, after Estonia had re-established its independence. But in my personal opinion, väliseestlane is a neutral term. There is another problem connected to this. This goes rather far away, and that is, who is an Estonian living abroad or not. Many of the descendants are not, how shall I say it, pure Estonians. They have a Swedish or non-Estonian mother or father, and their descendants. But that's another question, I think.
If I may comment, I've been thinking about that because I've been living in Canada almost 9 years now. I don't feel like väliseestlane, of course, because I think of myself as eestlane. But I totally understand that we need a word to name the group of Estonians who are not living in Estonia. So it's like two different things. What we think of ourselves, what is our identity, and another is that we need the tools to talk about those people who are living somewhere else. So when people feel like very touchy about someone named in väliseestlased, I try to explain that it's not, it's very, like you said, it's very neutral word, right?
Yes, I agree totally.
First there, then there.
I'm sorry, I have got a loud voice. I think I could have made it without it. I just wanted to add, my name is Tiiu Salaso, and I have lived in Australia for over 60 years. So I qualify for the term väliseestlane, and I find it totally neutral. But a term that I do object to is ulgueestlane. And I have heard that mentioned both in writing and in speech. And another thing that makes me see red is when we are described as migrants. We were not migrants.
Well, that's a political, that's due to the official designation during Soviet times, of course.
So thank you very much. I will respond to Mrs. Salaso. So nowadays we are very often using the expression hargmaine eestlane. So it's every decade is creating a new words, and I think it's nice. Estonian will be richer. Thank you.
If I may comment on the term ulgueestlane, the first time I heard it, I thought it was a joke. But there are contexts in which it has been used as a term, more or less. Of course, this word also has another etymology, I think. Not only with hulkkuma, to go around, but also as a Finnish loan word. Ulko means the same as välis in Finnish.
I'm Liivi Jõe from Mulgimaa, and I'm one of the 1944 refugee group, and one of those who finds it offensive to be called a väliseestlane because I was told that in 1944 it was decreed here that everyone who left in 1944 shall henceforth be called a väliseestlane, and they emigrate. They did not refugee, therefore they were not refugees, as we called ourselves põgenikud, refugees. There is a distinction between one who emigrates and one who refugees. And we always made that distinction because politically we lived in exile. And that's for semantic people with a semantic base to decide. But I think to hold on to something from the Soviet era as something that is so important to the group that is being defined as such, I think is something linguists should discuss amongst themselves. Thank you.
I shouldn't comment upon English usage because my English is rather poor, but as far as I know, migration and migrant is a cover term for all kinds of people leaving a country, whatever the reason is, political or economic or personal or others, but I might be wrong.
Those who left in 1944 intended to return.
Yes, they did.
They did not emigrate, they refugeed with intent to return.
Yes, that's correct.
Therefore,
that the 1944 refugees and 45, they intended to return to Estonia. That of course, that is correct.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we started the Baltic Heritage Network, that was the main discussions we started with, how to call those people. And we are still here discussing the same question, because it is very personal. And that's why probably. But let's give a hand to Professor Raag from Uppsala, our keynote speaker. Aitäh.
Thank you.
So our next speaker comes from Germany. Gerd Franzenburg is from the University of Münster. And he was talking about the new how to cope with diaspora situations, some psychological remarks concerning Latvian life in Münster since 1948. And Riina would help us with equipment.
Yes, thank you very much for invitation, for the opportunity to speak as neither Latvian, neither Estonian, neither Lithuanian, but congratulations to all Estonians, to all Latvians, to all Lithuanians earning this year award of the Westphalian Prize of Peace, of the Westphalian Peace, remembering the treaty 370 years ago in Münster, which founded the new Europe. And because Münster is too small to host millions of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, the Lord Mayor and his team, the jury of this award, has decided to invite your presidents. And I'm very glad to have these persons in our town, particularly the Latvian president who will visit Latvian Center in Münster, where I were for some years the chair member and nowadays a scientific consultant and counselor, and therefore I'm glad to hear about it. But even more, I appreciate the reasons I noticed for this award for these three countries and instead for the presidents, because they maintained a European kind of Estonianness, Latvianness, Lithuanianness, and particularly in our times of nationalism, of popularism, which seem to destroy the European idea, it's of great importance to focus on this aspect. And as a teacher of adult education and of psychology of religion and of spirituality in the Lutheran faculty in Münster, I'm concerned with this issue of maintaining this way of cultural identity until one destination which seems empty like this bag, but it's filled with emotions, filled with hopes, with fears, filled with organization, with plans, and filled with experiences, both experiences people have made in these 100 years and the expectations they have for the next century correspondent to each other. And my research concerns this correspondence between expectations, emotions, hopes, and experiences, and particularly the way between this maintaining of Estonianness, Latvianness, Lithuanianness, and this way can be characterized as a chain of decisions, each decision similar to a labyrinth, but there are these two keys to open this labyrinth, to cope with these challenges of each decision. And we have heard what decisions were made in circular way during the last decades and centuries. Each decision depends on both on the experiences and the expectations, and often is caused by situations, by events when we remember, when we are planning something for the future, when we are discussing in conferences like this one. But my intention working with the students and as a researcher, as a historian, and as the chair of an adult education association focusing on historical education. This process should be transparent, this process should be systematic and should be like a constructive remembering. A constructive remembering which recognizes that memories are not quite clear, but constructions, similar as expectations, are not clear but constructed by our wishes, by our fears, by our decisions and experiences. Constructive remembering means transforming remembering, transforming by encoding and decoding experiences, and we will discuss in the next days such encoding, such codes of remembering, of experiencing in narrations, in flags, in colors, in songs, in dramatic plays, in myths, in kinds of artificial objects of any kind. And people in each situation, whether circular or linear, have to decode these cultural codes to find out their cultural identity, find out how to cope with the new situation, with the question whether I resist or resign, whether I will be a part of the host society, assimilated, or a strong community within this society, whether I remain with this language or will communicate as any of the people around in this host country and host society. And therefore, this constructive reconstruction, this constructive remembering is first of all contextualization, is the attitude to decode by forming a framework, by forming a certain context for these cultural codes, which we will be discussing in these days. And I'm researching in the Latvian Center in Münster when visiting events, when visiting dancing, playing, dramatic plays, when looking at symbols, when listening to narrations or mythical text. I find out this maintaining of cultural heritage, this maintaining of cultural identity is a chain of decisions, is a way towards unknown destination, has to do with reframing the old, remembering, reframing the old status when changing from majority to minority status, when changing the home, which is not only geographical but mythical and symbolic, meant, and by changing cultural patterns, by changing value systems, belief systems, which, as we discussed, include stereotypes or terms, decisions, how I will be characterized, what name can be given to certain persons, and therefore often also stigmatization. And by researching the situation of Latvian displaced persons in Münster after World War II, and in the last months, the situation after World War I often was confronted with such discussions that terms are not only terms, but biographies and emotional rememberings. And therefore, such chain of decision, such way of maintaining Estonianism, Latvianism, and Lithuanianism is worth any case, any kind of award. And therefore, again, congratulations and thank you for attitudes and for the listening and for your questions and for the discussions. Thank you very much.
We have to share the mic. Questions?
Is there a large Latvian community in Munster, and how assimilated do you feel they are?
There's a large community, depending on the Latvian gymnasium after World War II, which invited students from all over the world and made Münster in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s hidden capital of Latvia when Latvia didn't exist. In our times, there might be 200, 300, 400 Latvians in the town, but for certain circumstances, events, there are some 100 Latvians together in this center, which now is an invitation for students preparing for Olympic Games and for World Championships. And it's a model of other centers which are founded in other parts of Germany until about 10 years ago, only in Oldenburg, on the southern part of Germany, Esslingen, were communities of Latvians. But I'm very glad that it is not only a meeting point for former displaced persons or their children, but Latvian students are in this chair of the center, and they founded one choir after the other and one dancing group after the other. And I suppose they feel something about this decoding of traditions, not to copy one-to-one, but to find their own way of expressing these impressions of being Latvian in a very modern way, not only the old songs, the old dances, but yes, when I'm visiting such events, I'm astonished that it's possible to decode such cultural codes, and very inspiring, and I'm very glad to be a part of this community. And this work is honored by this award in 2 weeks about. Other questions?
Anna mikrofoni.
No, I was just wondering, was there a so-called old Latvian community there, or are these so-called new Latvians to tie in with the Estonian previous discussion?
Both groups are present. We have made a DVD 10 years ago when young students from a Münster school with Latvian students made interviews with former DPs from Latvia in Münster, and this DVD is sold in all countries around the world in Latvian communities. And this generation is still alive by discussing with the young one about new kinds of choreography, of fashion, of meals, and how to maintain and to transform Latvianness in abroad in this community. And yes, I'm from an external point of view are fascinated by this approach, and perhaps we are able to discuss the aspects during this conference between the sessions. I thank you for interest, and thank you for this discussion, and all the best for the next days.
We thank you, Gerd. Thanks very much. We have almost an hour until the coffee break. I'm not sure if the coffee is ready yet, but we had a short discussion with Riina that maybe now that's the moment to talk a little about the exhibit, which your director mentioned already, and on which we worked together with Riina like some 4 years ago already, right? And for me it was even a longer project. So we are talking now about the exhibit, about food factories and restaurants in Estonian food factories and food shops in Toronto. And as all väliseestlased know very well, along with churches and schools, the food shops were the first ones which were founded or established. Because if we go to live abroad, we will miss those familiar tastes from our homes. And that was the reason why Estonians opened quite a lot of food factories in Toronto. And when I moved to Toronto, I almost from the very beginning started to hear those stories about Poco meat and Ronems, konditriäri and things like that. And then I started thinking that why we don't make an exhibit about that, because that's really something which touches everyone on a very personal level. And when I went to my own archives, Vemu archives in Toronto, there was almost none photos from those times, not to talk about documents or other sources. So it was sure that we have to start our very first collecting campaign, and that's what we did. We announced our first campaign that we are looking for all kind of sources which tell those stories. And that was also very sure that I needed some partners, because back then I think it was just me and one part-time worker who were working for the archives. So that was pretty sure that we need a strong partner. And it didn't take much to convince Riina to jump in. And that's how we started working together with Estonian National Museum. Riina came to Toronto twice, I think, for that reason. And once there was Maida Selgma, a cameraman, also there. And we made quite many very interesting interviews. And it turned out that we had such a great audiovisual material that we didn't got only an exhibit, we also made a documentary. And it has been shown here, I know, at National Museum and other institutions in Estonia as well. I think there are close to 10 screenings up until now, I think. And that was especially interesting. We showed first time at the opening of the exhibit this film, and you could feel this emotion, how people went back to those times which the film was talking about. And one key to those emotions, it was not just food, which we were talking mainly, but it was also music, because Kaisa Pitsi, the film director of the film, a young filmmaker from Estonia, she went to our archive and found that we have a great LP collection. So she chose Väliseesti muusika, the music of Estonians abroad, to cover this topic. And that was also very, very emotional. So I'm really very grateful to Riina, Merike, Maido, and everyone who helped us with that. So the exhibit was designed here, printed out here in Estonia, and sent to Canada. In Canada, it went also to Montreal, to the Latvian Center, where it was also quite popular. And now it's here in Estonia, and I hope that will be not the last stop for this exhibit here in Tartu. And actually my dream is that next year, when we will have a ESTA festival coming to Helsinki, Tallinn and Tartu, that would be great to have a festival of exhibits about Estonians living abroad, because we have quite a long list already of those exhibits, and I know that the Estonian memory institutions also have been working on that topic for many years now. So that would be great to cover Estonia for the next summer with that kind of exhibits. So this is the beginning, maybe, of that project. And I'm pretty sure that Riina would like to add something. Please come here.
Well, I am not quite prepared now, but yes, when Piret asked me, am I interested about to make such a exhibition or research? So I said quite quickly yes, because I am a food person. I love food, I love cooking, and also in my family, we all live in Estonia, but we have quite big traditions about food and making the birthdays and the food in birthdays. And when I first time traveled to United States in 1996 and 2 years later to Toronto, then I saw almost the same food in Estonian families as in Estonia. And I remember especially in New York, or actually in Lakewood, I had the best mulgikapsad in my life. Never so good in Estonia. And in Toronto also very, very good potato salad and rosoli and such things. And I said yes, but actually it was quite a difficult topic because, as Piret said, there was so few material or little material in archive in Toronto, and actually same in our archive in Estonian National Museum. Of course, we had those questionnaires about refugees and almost 200 answers. And we also asked about food, but the answers were very short. Yes, we had Estonian food, but no longer descriptions. And it meant that we had to make interviews and collect the material ourselves. And what I also hoped that Toronto newspapers. There was actually 2 newspapers at this time in Toronto that they have some articles about those stores or bakeries. But yes, there was, I think it was 1952, there was 2 pages about bakeries and things, and later almost nothing. Very, very few information. Yes, there was reklamid, commercials or advertisements, but no articles which wrote about it. It shows that the food is important, but we don't talk about this like officially or publicly or so, and it was not I think for Estonians living abroad was more important was political issues and like high culture, but the food was somehow too everyday or too much everyday. So it was very interesting, and also we made this exhibition and documentary, and also the last yearbook I wrote an article about this, and who knows, maybe later we will do something more. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, actually there was a plan that we wanted to make kind of a coffee table book, because that's really very popular topic. It has become a popular, as you said. It wasn't like topic in an old days because it was too low. But times have changed and we have great material. So when we get bored, one day we'll start working on that book.
That's great what's going on in Toronto and Tartu. I'd just like to add, in the US, 2 Estonian cookbooks have been published. I think I remember the names correctly. The first was written by Vivi Piirisild in Los Angeles, of our generation, and the second one was published by Karin Annus in New York, of the younger generation, both on Estonian cooking. So I hope the archives are aware of it and include them in their bibliographies at least, so future researchers can find them when active cooking may not be going on anymore. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually by now we have quite a great collection of cookbooks at our archives. And we had before we started the exhibit, but it doesn't give you the history. And what was also very exciting was how to find those people, because I was new to the community, and some community members were not taking part in Estonian life anymore. So I was looking for a daughter of Hamjärv's family, like maybe for 2 years. I found her, and I wasn't sure if she comes for an interview, which we booked with her, but she came and she gave a really great interview and talked very openly also about the Estonian community, and I understood the reasons why she didn't want to be a part of that community anymore. So we got this additional information about the community, and we became really great friends with Aina Rooneem, the second wife of Rooneem's bakery shop owner. And she's a great lady. She's in her 90s, I think, by now. And she's baking, for every Christmas, she's baking 50 pounds of piparkoogid, gingerbread. And she just gives it away to the family members and friends. And I am now one of those friends. And I get a big box of great gingerbread for every Christmas. And there are like 4 different kinds of gingerbread she makes. And nobody knows the recipes. So that she gave it out only to her granddaughter, or the granddaughter of her husband. And the girl is living in Australia, so she's the only one who knows the secret how to bake those special gingerbread. You may be interested what's happening now in Toronto. When we were doing this exhibit, we had 2 places where you could get tasty kringel and the pastry and rosoli and kartulisalat and seapraad and sauerkraut. But by now, both those places are closed. First, Mennama's place was closed some 3 years ago, I think. And last year, Ülle Veltman closed the Estonian restaurant at Estonian House because there were not so many people who visited the place, and like it didn't make any sense to keep this business open, which means that we are open for new enterprises. So please come and open the place for us because we really need Estonian food. And to talk about the most important foods Estonians still that are preparing in Canada, one of those is kringel, of course. I'm pretty sure that it's the same for all the communities elsewhere. There's hardly any celebration or lecture or exhibition opening when we don't serve the kringel. And Ülle Veltman still bakes the kringel if we want that. So you can't go and buy it from the shop, but she's catering. And the same girl who made a film about our exhibit 2 years before the exhibit was ready, she made a very short documentary about kringel, just about making the kringel. And it's one of the most popular short films from Estoc's short film competition, which we see like almost every year. But my suggestion would be, if coffee, yeah, comments, I need to come with a mic because otherwise other people would not hear.
Thank you. You were talking about kringles in Toronto, and that reminded me a story about my husband's secret family. About my husband's secret kringle recipe. So in their family, there was a lady who was baking like exceptional kringles. And during the Second World War, they had to flee, and they fled to Toronto, and they took their kringle recipe with them. Because there was like really limited correspondence between the relatives in Toronto and relatives in Estonia. So the recipe was lost for the Estonian part of the family. But when the borders opened up, the recipe of the kringle was one of those first pieces of information that came back in to Estonian family. So, and now we have the recipe of the kringle again, and it's like scrumptious, and we're baking it all the time, and it's like really going well. And now we have friends in Toronto, so we gave the recipe back to Toronto again. So we're baking this kringle in Estonia and in Toronto, and now in Boston also. So, thank you.